Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast. It's great to be with you all again, and I've got Jon Davies back on the podcast. Hi, Jon.
Hello, Dan. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks. Very good. It's great to have you again. We're going to be asking a really simple question. Famous last words.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
Very simple question. Which books should be in the Bible and why? Two questions, I suppose, actually.
Yeah.
And I think you might say to us, it's not quite as simple as all that, but then maybe there's a journey we can go on as we go through this episode. So that's the question we're going to be answering.
Exactly that. Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, great. There's a word, isn't there, that's used to describe this. It's the canon of Scripture. So you might have come across that before. You might have thought, what on earth does that mean? Let's just put that on the table first of all. What do we talk about when we mean the canon of Scripture?
Yeah, I would probably argue it's a slightly unhelpful term in
Okay.
a way. The original, it's from a Greek word that actually you do find in the New Testament for those people who are real sort of Bible nerds out there. It's the word used, sometimes translated as rule. And the kind or line sometimes, and the logic is it's a yardstick by which you evaluate whether something's in or out. But I tend to think the way you framed it is much more helpful, which is which books are in the Bible, or which books do we think come from God? That's probably the best way to frame it. And academia loves its fancy terms, canonicity, canon, all that. But yeah, I think the broad theme is which books are in and out is the topic at hand.
Okay, yeah, and we've got the Old Testament canon, the New Testament canon, so obviously they'll have their own quirks, won't they? Whether or not we'll be able to get through that in a level of detail, as we always try and do on this podcast, try and not make it too much of an overview. We've got to delve into some helpful information to help the listeners.
Yeah.
But also try really hard to make it accessible. So yeah, fancy words off the table. I'll try and hold you to that, Jon, as we go through it.
Hold me to that bar.
Okay, that canon, in fact. It's quite an important question, this is, isn't it? It sounds really simple.
Yes.
What books should be in the Bible? But it's really important. Let me just give you a flavour of some of the things I've thought of before, or some of the things I've heard. Firstly, Christians base their beliefs on the Bible, don't they? On Scripture. So that if you suddenly ask this question, how do you know what actually should be in the Bible? Then that could make quite a big difference to your belief, or where you can turn to. So that feels like a critical question. And there's a few other things I'll just throw out. Often you might hear the Bible was decided at the Council of Nicaea or some other church council and things like that many years afterwards. So how do we know what was originally there? So things like that. Presumably you've come across those sorts of things and you'd recognise the challenges, or maybe they're a bit simplistic, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think they're very good questions. And it's probably worth saying we're not going to talk in this podcast about why a God would write a book, for example. We're assuming that is true, and that we're assuming that this God has wanted there to be a book, and it's then which books are in. And then a lot of stuff you've just mentioned, was it defined by a council? It's almost certainly not the Council of Nicaea, historically speaking, on any level. But the question, broader one, which is for the various, who decided and how did they decide what was in? And one point that's often pushed forward is it was decided 200, 300, 400 years after the time of Jesus by a group of people squirreled away in a castle type of thing. And I think if you've never looked at this topic and you're a believer, that does sound a little bit weird, honestly. Like, why did they decide that in the way they did? And I guess as we go through tonight, I'm going to suggest I don't think that's really how it was decided, but definitely these are good things that people have probably heard. People have read the Da Vinci Code. There's definitely a lot of this. People might have seen a lot of stuff in the press in the last few years about the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Jesus' wife. And sometimes you see these news articles and things, like they might have a clue what was in the Bible. And I think those things add a lot of uncertainty to the topic. And hopefully we'll unpack that this evening. But yeah, those are legitimate things that people have probably heard in popular culture about this topic.
So it does reach the popular level, these sorts of questions. And am I right in thinking, so you've got the Protestant tradition, haven't you? The Protestant Bible, the canon.
Yep.
But actually, it's not universal across all Christian denominations, is it, or traditions? So you've got a Catholic canon, Eastern Orthodox, different again.
And this is worth teasing out because I think there's probably some Christians who think this topic is actually quite easy and, I've got my Bible today, It's got 66 books in. Why is anyone even doubting that?
There's a song about it, isn't there? But yeah,
there is.
It's got to be right.
That some of us learn in Sunday school. But I guess the point you've made is a good one. So the Protestant canon has 66 books, but yeah, the Catholics have more, and it goes anywhere from 66 to sort of 80 something within the Christian communities. And then even later than that, you get churches like the Mormon Church, they have 3 books on top of what is in Scripture. So and sometimes people use the argument, I've got my Bible, God would have providentially cared for it enough to give me what I think is right, ergo I'm right. That argument just doesn't really work, because a person in a different church with a different number of books could use the same argument and they'd be disagreeing. So your house is divided, so it can't stand on that. So I think it's a great point. There are different numbers of books in different people's canons, different people's Bibles.
Okay, so that poses a bit of a challenge straight away, doesn't it?
Yep.
So, what books should be in the Bible? Actually, you've got differing conclusions amongst the wider net of Christianity. So yeah, that might make me, you and others, listeners, uncomfortable. So it's important to think about it, isn't it?
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, not only that, but if, for example, you pulled out the first version of the King James Version Bible that was published in 1611, that also had more than 66 books. If you go back to the 3rd and 4th century, you'd find manuscripts that have more than the 66 books. I.e., it's not just today that's a challenge, it's also a historical challenge too, that different Christian communities at different times have had different books in.
Okay, yeah, so it's a long-running problem, a long-running question.
Yeah.
Any other challenges, anything else that we need to put up front at this?
Yeah, so I think there's quite a few. The most obvious is we don't have a table of contents.
Okay.
So it's not like there's a document that says this is, and forgive the sort of perceived irreverence, but it's not like we've got a letter from God saying, by the way, these are the books that are in. So as soon as you accept that, and I think everyone would accept that, then the question is, and by the way, the Bible was written over time, so it grew. You then have this question, look, how do you know which ones are in? Because we don't have a table of contents that says, by the way, these are in. And I think that ties into another thing that is worth us saying. The Bible was written in time and space in history. It wasn't written down on golden plates at a specific point in time. I think there's other things that are hard. Like, there's a lot we don't know. There was a quote I was reading in prep for this where it said something like, what we know is dwarfed by what we don't know about how the Bible came into existence. So take any book in the Old Testament. Sometimes who wrote it? When was it written? How was it copied? How did it become part of a compilation of books? Most of that we don't know. So I think it's probably worth a level of humility on this topic to say there's lots we don't know. We don't have a table of contents. Different Christians have different groups of books. It wasn't handed down on golden plates. And even to the extent of things like you get books quoted in the Bible that aren't in our Bibles. So I think it's not an easy topic when you start thinking about it. I guess it's the point of what we're trying to tease out so far.
Yeah. So books quoted that aren't in our Bibles, assuming that we're taking the Protestant tradition, or is that even the case?
But even the case exactly that. So, for example, most people can't pull a book of Jasher off the shelves.
Sure, yeah.
The Bible refers to it. There's a book of the Wars of the Lord in Numbers. I don't think anyone's got that in any canon. So, whichever canon you have quotations made, that we don't have access to those texts today.
Okay.
I actually don't think that's an issue, to be honest, but it's worth flagging that when people see it, sometimes they'll be like, hold on, it's sort of saying something like, I don't have this thing. And maybe I'll push it even further. You get some quotations in the New Testament that says, this scripture says this thing. You can go all the way through the Old Testament and not find that scripture.
Yeah, for example, Matthew 2, I think, is it the end of Matthew 2? He lived in Nazareth, so that which was fulfilled by the prophet, he should be called a Nazarene. That's right, isn't it? And there's nowhere that says that. Yeah.
But there's enough to make you think, something's going on there. That just means it's not as clean and as tidy as maybe the Western mind might sometimes want.
Yeah, there's an expectation that with a book, we perhaps haven't laboured this point actually, is it that, Christians have got their teaching from this book, this collection of books, the Bible, because the Bible in various places claims to have been God-breathed or inspired by God. So this is in some way a message from God. So you have an expectation, I think, in our minds that there should be no ambiguity about it.
Yeah.
But like you say, all these points do raise ambiguity, and it's important to put them on the table and confront them and think about them carefully, and maybe we'll come up with some way of thinking through them that is helpful, and maybe not. We'll see. Maybe now's the time to start thinking through how we might approach it, what you would advise, what's the best way of starting to deal with these challenges.
I guess all we've done so far is teased out it's probably not as easy as people might perceive. Now, some people, if they're listening to this, might know of the complexity that we've just teased out, but for some, particularly maybe Christians, some of that might be a bit like, God, like it really isn't as easy as I thought. Certainly when I first really thought about this topic in my early 20s, it is a bit of a head scratcher, and you'll be like, where do I go from here? So I think there's one or 2 points that might be really helpful as big zoomed out points, and you can interrogate me on them. The first is that the gospel message, the sort of good news about Jesus, had power before it was written down, as in the good news about Jesus was originally heard by people talking. So whenever people date that the biblical books were finished, let's say you say the end of the 1st century, just for argument's sake, the good news about Jesus was preached from, say, 30 AD, and none of the New Testament, as we would have it, was written then. So there's just something that says, actually, the good news about Jesus, you don't need the canon per se. You don't need those books per se to hear the gospel. It could be heard through people going around the Roman Empire teaching people about the resurrected Jesus. So I think that's just helpful, that like sometimes it feels almost so foundational as to be like, if we can't get this 100%, everything goes. I don't think that's true. I think the gospel can stand without knowing everything about the canon and having it all buttoned down. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, it's self-evident in the words of the New Testament itself, isn't it, actually?
Yeah.
It's describing what they did before these books were written, and how that they preached the good news all around the Roman Empire. Yeah.
And so that probably feels slightly weird for us, because we're generally, Christians are today a very bookish religion, rightly, and we have been since the start, but there was a period before the New Testament was even there, and people would hear the gospel, convert to Christianity, be baptized, start living amazing lives of faith. So I think that's probably a helpful framing point to make. And the other is just historically, so this is not with any theological lens on top, there is a lot more agreement than disagreement about the canon. So often, and I'm sure we'll get to this, they'll be like, oh yeah, but what about this book? But for the majority of books in the Bible, there's actually pretty common agreement. So I've tried to frame this numerically, because that's where I guess my head works. But of the sort of chapters that you would say, actually pretty much everyone agrees that these books are in, like most of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, most of the historical books in the Old Testament, Psalms, Proverbs, most of the prophets, most of the minor prophets, as we call it, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Luke's second part, Acts, wrote most of Paul's letters. You've got a lot of books there that basically there's no dispute over, historically speaking. So sometimes people really play up the, oh yeah, but there's disagreement. For sure there is. Historically speaking, there's definitely that. But there's also overwhelming agreement about the majority of books. So the stat is something like if you count the amount of chapters, just as a proxy for length, I couldn't find anywhere on the online that had a number of words. There's 1,200 chapters where you get real agreement.
Okay.
Then there's probably 80 chapters where it's not so, there's less agreement. It's still a lot of agreement, but less. And then probably somewhere between 140 and 400 chapters where you don't. And most of those are pretty fringe views. So you're still, even if someone was quite reductive and said, okay, I'll just take the ones where there was complete historical agreement, you still got most of what we would call the Bible. So that, you know, this kind of like faith can happen without it. And if you were really critical and just took historically what everyone agreed, you'd still have the majority of it.
Yeah, that's really helpful actually, because it can feel quite overwhelming when it's just put out there that, how do we know what books should be in? If decided at a council or whatever, and it feels like the whole thing should be chucked out. But I think what I hear you saying is, let's accept all the problems. If we do that, we're still left with quite a sizable proportion of this. And I think, again, we've got to adjust our expectations on this journey of trying to deal with this. Adjust our expectations from God must have produced this Bible that is perfect without any ambiguity, because we know there is ambiguity. Through history there has been. So we strip away the ambiguity. What do we have? We've got some certainty to build on. And I guess then the next question is, what do we have question marks over?
That's a good question. I guess take the Old Testament as it's most Christians would think of it, so that's the Hebrew scriptures. There's probably a few books in the Protestant canon where, again, I'm speaking more historically here than like theologically, but they're related. There was doubts expressed about books like Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Esther. They're probably the main ones where you get doubts, and they're for slightly different reasons, so I'll take them in turn. Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, for anyone who's read it, basically a piece of Hebrew poetry between a man and a woman, possibly his wife, and you can see why people wrestle with this, because it's a bit like someone said to me, it's almost, can a topic that's so obviously about sex and intimacy be in a holy book? You can see why people doubted it, and it doesn't seem to have a conclusion. It's just very different to lots of other parts of the Bible. It's actually quite similar to Psalm 45 for what it's worth, but it is different. So that one, I think the question was, can explicit content be in the Bible? Ecclesiastes, I think, again, feels quite different to the rest of the Bible. It's skeptical. The preacher in the book seems to advocate a sort of hedonism of form, go and enjoy your life, eat and drink, enjoy your life. And again, Jewish rabbis, but then later Christians, that weren't so sure about that. And then the other one is Esther. Famously doesn't have the name of God in. Again, a slightly odd, maybe unexpected story to have in. Seems to be nationalistic on some level. And I guess crucially for all three books, none of them seem to be explicitly quoted in the New Testament. For Christians, that was more of a factor than Jews for obvious reasons. So I think those are probably the Old Testament ones that have come under the most scrutiny. And you can see why.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's fair. And for clarity, there are ways of looking at those books that are different from the ways you've just described. And we're not here to judge that at the moment, but we're effectively just saying how easy it is to look at those books from a perspective through time, whatever sort of situation you are in time, and see why you might have a question over it. It might be that there are valid ways of interpreting them we're talking about.
Exactly. And that's almost, I think actually one of the things you end up getting to with this topic is actually a really helpful thing to do is to then spend some time in some of these books, and with some stuff maybe I'll share a bit later, some tools of how to think about this, you can then weigh them all up. But I think that's also an interesting act of faith as well, like judiciously balancing the evidence and proving all things, which is what Paul says. It's probably a good thing to do. And like I said, there's some pretty good reasons why all of them should be in my view.
Yeah. So, different books that look different from the rest of the scriptures. They're dealing with different topics, sometimes topics which you just do not expect to be in a book that is from God. That kind of makes sense. What's the situation with the New Testament then? Do we have which books are disagreed upon?
Yeah, I probably should just briefly say there is obviously a set of books sometimes called the Apocrypha. Historically, they were called Apocrypha, an apocryphal work, now more often called Deuterocanon, so second canon. And they're books that are included in the Catholic Bible, not in the Protestant Bible. They're also, I guess, in that kind of disputed category, and inevitably more disputed than the ones I mentioned.
So we're into jargon there, aren't we?
Yeah, we are.
Lots of jargon there. Examples of those books?
Tobit, Judith, things like that.
Was there an extra bit of Book of Daniel as well in that?
Bit of Daniel, bit extra of Esther. Yeah. So bits that, like, actually, if you often go to a church with an old Bible, it will have these books in the middle. Okay. And in the first 1611 King James version, they were printed with a note at the top saying Apocrypha. So they were definitely classed slightly differently, but they were in those Bibles.
Okay.
But that wasn't your question.
That wasn't my question, but that's useful, though. So we've got like a level of uncertainty, haven't we? They would be more uncertain because of how they've been treated. And then I suppose if we're now talking about the New Testament canon, we're back to this kind of first level uncertainty. Are there any books that fall under that?
Yeah, there are. This might be helpful. Almost think of books that you've got everyone on board as green. Then you've got like yellow books, which are like the Esther, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and then orange books, which are like the apocryphal books. So we're back into the sort of yellow category here in the New Testament. Yeah. And it's things like Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, Revelation. They're the ones that come into under question. But crucially, remember, the 4 Gospels, Acts, most of Paul's letters, pretty much everyone agrees on. And the reason for these New Testament ones being, I won't talk through all of them. Some of them are smaller, later books. And actually, I did hear someone say something interesting, which was, if someone ripped out the page, the 2 John and 3 John page of the Bible you've got at your church or your own personal Bible, how quickly would you notice? And it's a good question. Like, they're smaller books that don't deal with like massive foundational themes. You're less likely to notice. So they're less foundational in that sense. Maybe I'll take Hebrews as an example. Hebrews doesn't have an author append to it. So you might remember most books start with Paul, an apostle, or Paul and Timothy to this person. Hebrews just starts with God, who in sundry times diverse manners, all that. It was anonymous, which I think probably would have added some, who wrote this book? Is it genuinely from an apostle, or is it written later? Type of thing. And then maybe one other one is Revelation. Revelation, very different to the rest of the New Testament, like wild imagery that you, like dragons, women having children in heaven. It feels very different to much of the New Testament. Not so much the Old Testament, Daniel, things like that. And people questioned its authorship because it does seem to have been written later than some of the other books. So those books, again, were probably the ones that were in that yellow category. Large agreement, but not unanimous agreement.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Revelation certainly does stand out, doesn't it? But with lots of roots in the Old Testament, obviously, so that might be a way of possibly dealing with that. Okay, so we've got a lot of agreement. I think that was your main point. It's just to summarise, circle back to that. Your main point here at this point was, actually, there's more agreement than might be expected. There are some areas of valid disagreement that you can see why. What sort of conclusion do you take from this? The church communities or the Jewish communities discussing and wondering about these books. Is there a good way of thinking about that?
Yeah, a lot of what I've just tried to cover there is almost history. But I think it tells you a couple of things. One, it tells you that the faith communities, whether Jewish or Christian, really thought hard about what scripture was and what it wasn't. And it also tells you something very interesting about the first century church and maybe the second century church, that you had a pretty decentralized, fairly fluid structure to the early church. So sometimes people try and argue, it was imposed on the church by sort of hierarchy. I really don't think you see that in the eastern parts of the empire and in the western parts of the empire, based on the manuscript traditions you have. You do see some differences, which I think does give you a thinking community. That it wasn't like they were just waiting for some edict from Rome. They were trying to work through and prove and test which books were in and out. And I think that's encouraging. Yes, it might feel a bit awkward, particularly if we've always felt like the bits in the leather Bible we've got are set and certain, that to have these sort of a few books, they didn't quite agree on. But I think it tells you that there was faith community really thinking and reflecting on what scripture was and what it wasn't, and how they could work it all out.
Do you see a parallel in sort of textual criticism as well? So looking at the manuscripts and all the different variants that there are, and that at one level, if you're unfamiliar with that and the process that goes on, looks absolutely overwhelming. And how can you possibly know what the original chapter said? Because you've got all these different words, sentences and things. But then when you apply some sort of science to it, or some sort of process, methodology of tracking the variants, you can see actually these assist, and they show all the scribal notes in the margins, and they show a community that valued these texts and worked with them and copied them, and obviously made mistakes in copying, sometimes deliberately made mistakes, but for reasons that they thought were good reasons. It just shows that similar sort of thing. Do you think there's a parallel there?
Yeah, I think that's a good parallel. I hadn't really thought of it like that, but yes, I think there is. And I think often it's quite interesting. I say interesting, let's refine it. If you're interested in this topic, to read how some of the kind of writers in the 2nd and 3rd century wrestle with this topic is really quite interesting, because they are saying, we know this one's from an apostle, so we're pretty sure that one's okay. But this one doesn't look like it's actually from an apostle. It may be even someone pretending to be an apostle. Ergo, we're not going to let that one in, type of thing. So some of the reasons that they had, we can actually think, there's a pretty good test for us to think about, do they come really from the apostles and from people close to Jesus or not, as the case may be. But yeah, that comparison's good.
Okay. Have you got any other important things that we need to do when we approach this topic?
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of points. And this is, I think, personally for me, the most helpful point,
Okay.
or one of the most helpful points, aside from the sort of more apologetic-y type of arguments I've used already, like more agreement than disagreement, is
Yeah.
for those of us who follow Jesus, like the reason most of us would follow Jesus is because of the resurrection. That's the claim, that the big claim that's made, that you can go somewhere to validating. And when we look at the Gospels, the four Gospels, which again, most people are pretty happy with, you find that Jesus has a very high view of Scripture. And interestingly, when he is working with what his scriptures were, i.e. the Hebrew scriptures, there's actually real agreement between him and the people he's talking to about what Scripture is. So this is a point that one writer, F.F. Bruce, makes, and I think it's good, where he says that sort of Jesus and the Jewish leaders of his time, you never find them arguing over which books are in and out. By that point, there's sort of commonality. So when Jesus says, oh, but the scriptures say this, you don't find one of them going, hold on, I don't agree with that. So that's pretty interesting for me, that Jesus, who seems to have a really high view of what Scripture is, it can't be broken, he says, and he quotes it with some authority. I think that does a lot to say to us. Let's look at what Jesus thought was Scripture and what he quoted. And actually, you do, it's very similar to what we've done tonight, get a lot of the Old Testament coming through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Like, he quotes lots of the historical books, he quotes lots of the prophets, he quotes the Psalms. He clearly has a deep understanding of Scripture in the way he teaches parables. So that's, if we believe Jesus rose from the dead, then he's an amazing, special person, son of God maybe, and he anchors a lot of his beliefs in that Scripture. That kind of really helps me. Yes, you might have a few fringe cases, Esther and Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, but for Jesus that was special and important, and he believed in them. So that I find very helpful, particularly when we think about the Old Testament.
Okay.
And you get stylings like some of you listening will know, where Jesus quotes all from the death of Abel to the prophet Zechariah. And that sort of spans like the large block of text that we would know as the Hebrew Old Testament. It goes from sort of Genesis to Chronicles, which was the last book they had. And
so to explain that, because Abel is murdered in the book of Genesis, and then there's a prophet Zechariah who's murdered in the book of Chronicles, which comes at the end of the Hebrew scriptures. So the Old Testament's ordered differently, which we've talked a lot about in this podcast in various episodes. So yeah, that's a really good indication that Jesus thought about the shape of the canon of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, in that way. Yeah,
exactly that. So I find that helpful, particularly when we think about the Hebrew scriptures. But when we think about the sort of Christian scriptures, and maybe the Hebrew scriptures as well, I think if we believe these documents really had God's hand involved in them, they carry their own weight. They have a sort of authenticating power of themselves. And I think you can test that to some extent. For the New Testament books, there's like things like, I've written this on my notes as like a checklist, but you'll see what I'm getting at. One, do they have consistency with the teaching of Jesus? Two, are they consistent with the scriptures that Jesus knew? Do they have depth, like hidden complexity, like deep textual connections with other parts of scripture? Do they have a genuine connection with Jesus' apostles? Can we validate any of their eyewitness testimony and historical accuracy? Do they make a claim to be inspired? Do they make prophecies that then, and predictions that then come true? And then were they accepted by the community of faith? Now, view that almost like a 8-point, 9-point checklist kind of thing. And actually, most of those things were the ways that the earliest Christians thought about this. And I think you can actually then, as an individual believer, weigh up those books against what other scriptures say, or the scriptures of Jesus, or what we know of, allied with the historical exercise that can help you tease out that these documents have a power in themselves. You're not waiting for some church canon to decide, or church group to decide 5 centuries later. You can validate them on their own merits. And I think when you do that, there's some amazing scholarship of the last couple of years on the Gospel's reliability, or the way that the Luke and Acts were brought together with themes and stuff that you can see real dense, clever stuff going on. That, again, you could argue is just human, but is definitely pointing to some form of divine hand behind the thing.
Yeah, it does. Something that shows it was written with the intention of following on from something, if it's full of these intertextual links to other passages. For example, you might look at a Revelation, the suspect book of Revelation, a little bit odd, a little bit strange, with its weaving all these themes together. When you immerse yourself in it, actually, you might start to think, this is actually telling a story that fits with the rest of the grand sweep of Scripture that we know. That takes a long time, and there is in our archives a 6-part series on Revelation. So if you've not heard that, go back and listen to it and test it, see if you think it's genuine or not.
Yeah.
I think that's really helpful.
And maybe done. There's other details in there that often people think of the New Testament as being written by one, like different books by one person. Often they are co-authored, or you find that there's a community behind a document. So in John's Gospel, the writer says, "I'm writing these things," and then a group say, "And we can validate that this is true." Paul's letters are often Paul and Timothy and Silas writing these. There's a lot of stuff built in it that we won't have time to go into any detail on, but it just gives you, there's a lot that you can go at to then go, that makes sense why the early community of faith accepted that as a book, because it's got all these things going for them, because the books themselves or the letters themselves had some weight of their own.
Okay. I'm going to do something that probably isn't recommended normally on a podcast, is just go back to something that you said about 10 minutes ago. And because there was lots of things being said, but I think this might be worth just teasing out. You said something about Jesus dealing with people at the time who agreed with him on Scripture, and I presume you're referring to Pharisees at that point, because his main argumentation was with Pharisees. But he did speak to Sadducees, didn't he?
Yes.
Who I think only accepted the Torah, the first 5 books. Probably less, he probably dealt with them less, but a little bit of his discussion is with the Sadducees. But I wonder, because when he talks to them in the Gospel accounts, it records him quoting the Torah. He goes back to the law. He doesn't bother quoting the prophets because they didn't accept it. And I wonder if that's an example of effectively the thing that you're suggesting here, that where there's disagreement, strip it away, go back to what is agreed upon. And Jesus is effectively doing that same thing there to establish something that he's trying to teach. And maybe there's an example of that, bit of an obscure and unique example. But
no, that's a good one. And the example that I think you're thinking of or one of them is where he's talking to them about resurrection or something. And he actually refers back to Exodus 3 and the sort of burning bush and how God revealed himself to Moses at that point. And that is a good point. And that's why sometimes I think for us, when we're talking to people about this topic, if we major on this point about the really, actually pretty much everyone's comfortable with these books, I still think you can get pretty much the large part of what the teaching of God is. And actually the gospel, as we all know, is pretty simple. That really you can write on a page.
Sure.
And so you've got the overwhelming majority are the same. So if someone's not sure about Revelation, maybe that can come later in their discipleship. Core parts of the gospel are really solid, which I think is your point, that Jesus uses the bits. We're like, I agree with that bit. Actually, you can still understand more about God from the bit you agree with, and then let's work on the other bits later.
Start with where people are and build on that. And it's for ourselves as well. Start with where you are and then build on that. Okay, so we've talked about all sorts of different things, haven't we? What about the way early Christians started to view their own writings, the writings of the New Testament? There were there's often a sense, isn't there, if you don't know the history, that you read the Old Testament, you read the New Testament, it's the letters around the church, the early church, and then everyone stopped writing. But of course that's not true, is it? People did carry on writing, but we've got like a cut-off period which can feel a bit arbitrary. And what do we do with that?
Good question. It seems from the evidence we have that from very early on that the Christian community was viewing what we would think of as New Testament books or letters as scripture on par with the Hebrew Old Testament scriptures. There's 2 examples in the New Testament itself. One is in 1 Timothy, where it quotes scripture. One bit comes from Deuteronomy, another bit comes from Luke. And then there's a bit in 2 Peter, which, remember, is a contested book, but still considered pretty early, where someone quotes the writings of Paul and says they're scripture and God's given him wisdom to write. So even if you don't know about what to do with 2 Peter, what you have to accept is that early Christians believed that Paul's letters were scripture in the same way as they viewed Genesis as scripture, for example. And you do find early church writers quoting from different parts of the New Testament, whether it's Clement or Ignatius or Polycarp, or there's writings from, say, the first 100 years after the life of Jesus, where people are quoting other letters and books of the New Testament as if they were scripture. So that, and I think you mentioned this earlier, the kind of implied continuity of the Old Testament is really embedded within a lot of the New Testament writing. Some people think that, for example, Luke is written with a real Old Testament style of writing, and it captures lots of phrases and snatches from the Old Testament. And you can see that a lot of the New Testament is littered with Old Testament language. It implies it's part of this same bigger story. So that sort of thread, I think, is there. And that's partly why I think they viewed them as being scripture from so very early on.
That's really helpful. And I guess the things that were written afterwards, so you referred to Clement and Ignatius and Polycarp and stuff, they're not, there's not a sort of necessarily a two ways of looking at these writings. So they're either scripture or they're worthless. It's not necessarily that it's just two categories. So presumably they're, as a Christian might write a book today, as many Christians do, will write a book that can be helpful to someone, pointing to them to scriptural truths. These sorts of Christian writings as well are also valuable. Maybe not in the same way, but they're in a tier. Almost you can see a level of valuableness. That's probably not the right word.
No, but at the very least, they give you a historical glimpse into what the Christian community thought in that era. And I think that's helpful because they were much, much closer to these documents than we are. So if we want to understand history, they're really valuable. That's why I have it almost in the last in my category list as once you've got some reasons to believe it, was it also accepted by the early church? Yes, and probably for the reasons I've mentioned above. So I do think those are pretty helpful works. Good.
So I want to ask a question going right back to something I said at the start about church councils and stuff. We've talked about a lot. I said at the start, it's bandied around sometimes that people that, I think you said, squirreled away in the church somewhere were deciding what was in the Bible, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Do they fit into these councils, fit into the story at all? But also, is there some guy called Marcion? Does he feature in this story as well?
Yeah. Do the church councils play a role? Yes, they do. But what I think you'd see historically is, before you get to the church councils, by the sort of mid-2nd century, most historians would accept there's a sort of historical core of the New Testament and the Old Testament that most people are agreeing on. This is my agreement over disagreement point, where you've got 4 Gospels in the New Testament, Acts, most of the letters of Paul, and maybe a few others. That, by the sort of mid-2nd century, seems to be pretty solid. And then for the next couple of 100 years, there's definite debate over some of these other books. And I think really what Marcion kind of instigated, and others did as well, and that what these councils were debating is this sort of final the sort of table of contents bit. But what they're really trying to do is write down the list of authoritative books rather than writing an authoritative list of books, if you see the distinction. That what they're really doing is sort of confirming what was largely agreed within the church community of the time, rather than pronouncing for fresh, oh, by the way, we now accept Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Everyone's like, oh goodness, didn't know about those. That's not true at all. They were decided a while in advance. So I think, yes, of course they played a role, and particularly when you had the church and the state together in Rome, that's going to be powerful at imposing something on a community. But the idea that they decided something that was miles out of whack with what came before is just historically fanciful.
Okay, cool. So we've covered an awful lot of ground, I think. What you've done, if we just try and summarise and jump in if you want to join into this summary. See what I've learned from this. So basically, I think you set the challenge. There is a challenge to this topic. How do we know what books are in the Bible? It isn't as simple as all that. It is a challenging question. Therefore, can be a really troubling question. We didn't really talked much about this, but troubling to faith, and because if for one moment that you think you have the guidebook to life, and then suddenly have that question about, well, how do we know what should be in that book? Is it all wrong? How can I trust it? So then quite often can throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I think what you're advocating is to just take a more measured approach, and if even the worst case scenario is get rid of everything. You're not advocating for getting rid of what's in disagreement at all, are you? But what you're saying is, let's just assume that for the moment, there is very little in disagreement compared to what is agreed upon. So that's like the baseline. So start from that point and realise that there is much in agreement from all throughout sort of history, the period of the writing of the Old Testament, New Testament, and then the early church. there was a core collection of scriptures that had authority. And then what I think you're saying is there's then a measure of a standard, a way of going through these yellow books in your traffic light system, that you can go through these books and look at their sort of consistency or harmony and the internal authority that they have, and see that's why people were accepting them, even though on the surface they had people questioning them because of their content or because they looked different and things like that. But yeah, and actually what you're saying is spend time with these books that are troubling to see them and assess them and see what their value is. So I think that's what you're saying. And then you get right to the end of the story, and I've jumped over some important things actually, haven't I? The fact that Jesus truly valued the canon that he had, the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, and then that very early on Christians were valuing not only the scriptures that Jesus was using, but the early writings that were written in the flavour of the Hebrew scriptures. So there is a very quick recognition of the authority of some of these writings. So that's really important. And then right at the end, the church, much later on, but there were church councils that basically documented what was effectively an empire-wide loose agreement, I think, when they were confronting challenges, people like Marcion who were cutting out the canon and trimming down only to have a little bit of Luke left and things like that. They were responding to that kind of thing. Was that fair? What did you make of that?
Great summary. I think the only thing I would add is, key point for us to remember is that the gospel message is simple, and that was here before scripture was written. So in the order of priorities for us, we can probably hear the good news about Jesus without worrying about this topic in great detail. And that it's almost, once you've got the good news about Jesus on that kind of page of A4, we can believe that and follow Jesus and his amazing life of sacrifice. And then it's a question for us as to how we think about scripture. All those points you've made are then the right ones.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that's really helpful, really important. Okay, and then you can then learn to treasure the Bible. We are Bible feed, so it's all about the Bible, and we love it, and hopefully we can generate that within listeners. I imagine many of the listeners do. That's why they're listening. But it is also really important to think about these issues, because they're valid questions and valid issues that we can then think through critically and understand them from various points of view, and hopefully arrive at a sensible conclusion that's helpful for everyone. Super. Thanks a lot, Jon. It's a big topic, isn't it? All that detail you've skipped through, but hopefully we've dived into it enough to deal with some of those things. But by all means, if you have comments, questions, share them with us whether it's on the comments on YouTube, or get in touch on biblefeed.org or on socials or anything like that. So thanks a lot, Jon. Great to have you on again.
Not at all. Nice to catch up.